Okay, so let's have a little look at the earlier chapters of Frankenstein, and we'll focus on chapters 4 and 5. So we've got lots going on. We've got this kind of idyllic childhood, of course, and it seems idyllic in some ways, but there are these kind of oddly oppressive family kind of life. And we're automatically thinking about the lack of family life in Never Let Me Go. For example, the mention of in infants on page 21, it says, Tommy was always known for his temper, even in the infants. So we've got this kind of odd childhood in Never Let Me Go, where they have no parents and their special box is full of things they have made, and of course the reference to they having been at school, kind of institutionalized at school since they were very small. So this is that childhood. And then, for example, in Frankenstein, we've got this, by the way, you could have either edition. You could have either this edition, which is obviously well loved and falling apart, or you could have this edition. Yours has got a different cover, a newer cover than mine. So either of those are absolutely fine. Don't worry about editions. That's not a problem. But you've got this family life which seems very idyllic but also a little bit odd. Alphonse worshipping Caroline, and of course the age different, etc. So what's interesting is, let's run very quickly through those early chapters. The letters, of course, set up as we discussed the other day. A key quotation in the letters, by the way, I'm sure you found it already, is the quotation which you've annotated. One man's life or death were but a small price to pay for the acquirement of knowledge. And something that strikes me all the time is the key chapter in Never Let Me Go, where Tommy and Kathy go and see Miss Emily. And that is chapter 22. They tell them the Morningdale scandal, where they genetically engineered children to be cleverer. The Morningdale business is mentioned on page 257 all the way throughout. And they also learn about how it all came about, that after the war in the 1950s, the need to eradicate cancer. And the truth comes out, and the idea that actually this will of humanity to solve issues easily. They didn't want to think about the consequences, the moral consequences. And Walton makes me think of that in letter 4. One man's life or death were but a small price to pay for the acquirement of knowledge, which I have sought for the dominion I should acquire and transmit over the elemental foes of our race. He says he wants power, and it's okay for people to die if he has power. Very simplistically put there, but it basically the hubris, selfishness of man, which of course is the same in Never Let Me Go. And Frankenstein, we don't know his name in letter 4, but he is a mysterious stranger, attractive, and of course the irony is Walton brings him back to life. He's emaciated, he's near death, and Walton looks after him and sustains him and brings him back to life in a way that no one does for the creature. We've got at that point Gothic fascination with transgression and excess. These men keep women at a distance. Margaret Saville at the end of the letters. And then, for example, we have the beginning of chapter 1 where Frankenstein introduces himself. He discusses his family life, and you've discussed this already, but Caroline Beaufort is introduced as angelic, and women are presented as angelic and perfect creatures. When the students are in the cottages and they watch the television and see real life as something angelic, or Ruth goes and looks in at the office as if she could have a purpose, as if she could have a job, and the imagination, the life they wish they could have. Caroline is presented as perfect, idealized, that's it. He strove to shelter her as a fair exotic is sheltered by the gardener from every rougher wind, and to surround her with all that could tend to her pleasurable motion in soft and benevolent mind, the way that men should look after women, by protecting them. And that's in chapter 1. The theme of children, Frankenstein, as he says, from my copy, it's either on page 35, he says, I was their plaything and their idol. That sense that they worship Frankenstein and they see him as a god is very different to the experience for the students. They desperately want the attention of the misses, the guardians. And Ruth makes up that pretend influence as if she had special treatment. Elizabeth is introduced in chapter 1, and of course she is also perfect, fair-haired, beautiful, and of course high class. She doesn't fit in with the ruffian children she is in amongst. There is, in these early chapters, as you know, the kind of difference between the public and the private sphere. Chapter 2, on to Elizabeth. Elizabeth is, again, more deeply introduced. She is calm, She helps Frankenstein elevate himself, but he has a thirst for knowledge. He says in chapter 2, and it's the third paragraph, he says, "No human being could have passed a happier childhood than myself." And that always makes me think of the creature. Just for a moment, make sure that you think about when the creature discusses his childhood in chapter 11. He says, "It is with considerable difficulty I remember the original era of my being. All the events of that period appear confused and indistinct. A strange multiplicity of sensations seized me. I saw, felt, heard, and smelt at the same time, and it was indeed a long time before I learned to distinguish between the operations of these senses." He then talks about darkness and hunger and thirst. He goes to a brook and drinks from the stream. And his first acknowledgement is he feels tormented. Frankenstein describes his childhood as perfect, idyllic. Kathy thinks that Hailsham is likewise idyllic. They were treated so well and they had freedoms and education, art. But of course, neither Frankenstein's nor Kathy's childhood are perfect. There's a lack of parental involvement from the beginning, which is very curious as Kathy narrates her childhood. Frankenstein's is frankly oddly oppressive and built upon a sense that family life must be utterly perfect. But then you have the contrast of the creature. He's frightened. He gazed with wonder at the sounds and the scenery and is marveling at the beauty of creation. But he is alone. And of course, again, going back to Never Let Me Go, let's look for a moment again at page 259 of Never Let Me Go. They then discuss how perfect Hailsham was. And say on page 260, "You'd not sleep for days if you saw what still goes on in those places." So we have, from that early section, Hailsham and Frankenstein's childhood seem idyllic, perfect, countryside, space, ponds, art, guardians. Frankenstein's family, perfect, idyllic, family life. And yet they aren't. Then you have another contrast of the other places, Morningdale, other places that are mentioned. And there's that sense that Hailsham was perfect, other places were dreadful. Glenmorgan, the Saunders Trust, Hailsham are all mentioned as positive examples on page 258. But there's a sense that other places are just factories for clones. Likewise, the creature's first experience is desolate, lonely, hungry, desperate. So we've got this interesting sense of, are they perfect? And far from perfect. Always think about the comparison. William's born in chapter 2 of Frankenstein. And of course, there's that key quotation which you've noted. It was the secrets of heaven and earth that I desired to learn. Clerval is introduced, who is interested in heroism and travel. Agrippa, which I'll talk about in the context on YouTube. And for example, his childhood, Bellerive, and seeing very key moments, seeing lightning and the power of light. And the moment where we might say, heaven touched earth. He is utterly drawn to this. It is all inspiring. When I was about 15 years old, we'd retired to our house near Bellerive and we witnessed a most violent and terrible thunderstorm. It rolls around the mountains of Jura and the dazzling light. Now that's important as well. He talks about a dazzling light when in chapter 4, he discovers how to create life. A dazzling light, God-like power imbued upon him. Think about light as you go through the novel. On to chapter 3, by the age of 17. So we move more swiftly through his previous history. By 17, he decides he's going to go to Ingolstadt, and he's clearly very, very academic. But of course, Elizabeth caught scarlet fever, is gravely ill, Caroline catches it, and there's this idea of sacrificing oneself for another. Frankenstein says in chapter 3, he ardently desired the acquisition of knowledge. He seeks after knowledge all the time. And this is the master scientist. He moves from a scholar scientist to a master scientist, wanting to know more. Now, what's interesting is he says, and it's on either page 46 or I think or 36. We sat late, we could not tear ourselves away from each other except say farewell. This is him and Clerval saying goodbye. And he throws himself into the carriage, very distressed, malaise and melancholy. And he then says he believes he's unfitted for the company of strangers. He ardently desires the acquisition of knowledge. I had often, when at home, thought it hard to remain in my youth cooped up in one place and had longed to enter the world. Reminds me of the students. They long to go to Norfolk, the place where lost things are. They long to go to work and have a purpose. And Frankenstein says, now my desires were complied with, and it would indeed have been folly to repent. He feels now he's got the opportunity to learn. He must use it. He then says he had sufficient leisure, and the next paragraph says, the next morning. The next morning I delivered my letters of introduction and paid a visit to some of the principal professors. Chance, or rather, the evil influence, the angel of destruction, which asserted omnipotent, all-powerful sway over me from the moment I turned my reluctant steps from my father's door. He says, fate caused everything that happened. Totally lacks responsibility. In chapter 22 of Never Let Me Go, there is this sense of justifying what they did at Hailsham, how lucky they were. They think it's God-given, page 260 of Never Let Me Go. All they feel now is disappointment because we haven't given them everything possible. The sense they should be grateful, a lack of responsibility from Madame and Miss Emily, a lack of responsibility, saying these things were out of our hands. They were beyond our control. We did the right thing. And Frankenstein similarly saying, it was beyond my control. It was fate, the angel of destruction. Monsieur Kremp and Monsieur Waldman, very interesting scientists. 3, he says, such were the professor's words. Rather let me say the words of fate, announced to destroy me. As he went on, I felt as if my soul were grappling with a palpable enemy. One by one, the various keys were touched, which formed the mechanism of my being. Chord after chord was sounded, and soon my mind was filled with one thought, one conception, one purpose. So much had been done, exclaimed the soul of Frankenstein. More, far more will I achieve. Treading in the steps already marked, I will pioneer a new way, explore unknown powers, and unfold to the world the deepest mysteries of creation. Brilliantly Gothic, isn't it? I closed my eyes. I closed not my eyes that night. My internal being was in a state of insurrection and turmoil. I felt order would thence arise, but I had no power to produce it. By degrees, after the morning's dawn, sleep came, and we've got a sense that he's moving away from the norms of humanity. He finds he possesses a natural talent. Okay. And he says he was very unlike his colleague, Waldman and Kremp. Into that chapter, there's a paragraph which starts with, he took me into his laboratory. It's either on page 50 or it's on page 39, I think, in the other edition. He then took me into his laboratory and explained to me the uses of his various machines. In the context film, I talk about Aldini and Galvani. It's in context 2. It'll come up in a few days. Galvani and Aldini, instructing me as to what I ought to procure, what instruments I needed to get, and promising me the use of his own when I should have advanced far enough in the science not to derange their mechanism. He also gave me a list of books which I had requested, and I took my leave. Thus ended a memorable day to me. It decided my future destiny. And it's key, of course, because he starts believing that this is going to be what he is called to. And let's go on to chapter 4. Chapter 4. From this day, natural philosophy, and particularly chemistry, in the most comprehensive sense of the term, became nearly my sole occupation. I read with ardour those works so full of genius and discrimination which modern inquirers have written on these subjects. I attended lectures and cultivated the acquaintance of the men of science of the university, and I found in Monsieur Krempe even a great deal. So even in Krempe, who at first he thought was ugly and hideous, so we didn't like him, he found in even Krempe a great deal of sound sense and real information, combined, it's true, with the repulsive physiognomy, so he's hideously ugly, but not on that count less valuable. In Monsieur Waldman, I found a true friend, whose gentleness was never tinged by dogmatism, and his instructions were given with an air of frankness and good nature that banished every idea of pedantry. In 1,000 ways he smoothed for me the path of knowledge, and made the most abstruse inquiries clear, and facile simple. He made things clear and simple. He explained things to me, to my apprehension. My application was at first fluctuating and uncertain. It gained strength as I proceeded, and soon became so ardent and eager that the stars often disappeared in the light of morning whilst I was engaged in my laboratory. As I applied so closely, it may be easily conceived that my progress was rapid. My ardour was indeed to the astonishment of students, and my proficiency that of the masters. He says, you might think I was really quick at things, but I worked hard. Professor Krempe often asked me with a sly smile how the Cornelius Agrippa went on. Now, Agrippa promised that you could turn base metal into gold, and promised that you could do extraordinary things. And Krempe mocks him for that. Krempe is right. Krempe says that actually this is ridiculous and these notions of science have been completely exploded and you can't do that. But of course, Frankenstein holds on to these chimera, these false hopes. 2 years passed in this manner, during which I paid no visit to Geneva, but was engaged heart and soul in the pursuit of some discoveries which I hoped to make. None but those who've experienced them can conceive of the enticements of science. In other studies, you can go as far as others have gone before you, and there is nothing more to know. But in scientific pursuit, there's continual food for discovery and wonder. A mind of moderate capacity, which closely pursued one study, must infallibly arrive at great proficiency. Even those who aren't very bright can be very proficient in that study. And I, who continually sought the attainment of an object of pursuit that was solely wrapped up in this, improved so rapidly that at the end of 2 years, I made some discoveries in the improvement of some chemical instruments, which procured me great esteem and admiration at the university. When I had arrived at this point and become well acquainted with the theory and practice of natural philosophy as dependent on the lessons of all the professors at Ingolstadt, my residence there being no longer conducive to my improvements, I thought of returning to my friends in my native town, when an incident happened that protracted my stay. He basically said, after 2 years, he's learned everything he can learn from all the professors. I've learned everything I could possibly learn from them. I've learned everything. They could teach me nothing. I need to leave. Very hubristic. He's learned everything in 2 years that all his professors spent their lives studying. It shows he's intelligent, but also very hubristic. One of the phenomena that had peculiarly attracted my attention was the structure of the human frame. And indeed, any animal endued with life. Whence, where, I often ask myself, did the principle of life proceed? Now, you will watch on the second context, or possibly the third context film that I'm going to make about Lawrence and Abernathy, the life principle debate. Write that down. The life principle debate. This was a debate that was going on just before Mary Shelley was writing, between two scientists at the time, where they were arguing, very publicly arguing, two academics, about where did life come from, the life principle debate. I often ask myself, where did the principle of life proceed? It was a bold question, and one which has been considered as a mystery. Yet, with how many things we are upon the brink of becoming acquainted, if cowardice or carelessness did not restrain our inquiries. He says, basically, we could do, I apologize, I muffled that. We could learn lots of things, but cowardice or carelessness stops us. Is that it? Is it cowardice or carelessness that prevents us doing every scientific development that we can? Or is it moral scruples? And again, Frankenstein clearly is being set up as the master scientist, this hubristic overreacher Prometheus, seeking after the fire of the gods to bring down to earth, the master scientist, the overreacher. There is no question of whether he should I resolved these circumstances in my mind and determined thenceforth to apply myself more particularly to the branches of natural philosophy which relate to physiology. Unless I'd been animated by an almost supernatural enthusiasm, my application to this study would have been irksome. So he says, unless I was given this kind of supernatural power to pursue this, otherwise I would have got bored of it. Almost intolerable. To examine the causes of life, we must first have recourse to death. I became acquainted with the science of anatomy. Now, this was illegal at the time. Illegal. But this was not sufficient. I must also observe the natural decay and corruption of the human body. In my education, my father had taken the greatest precautions that my mind should be impressed with no supernatural horrors. I do not ever remember to have trembled at a tale of superstition or to have feared the apparition of a spirit. Darkness had no effect upon my fancy, and a churchyard to me was really the receptacle of bodies, a place where bodies are kept, deprived of life, which from being seat of beauty and strength had now become food for the worm. Now I was led to examine the causes and progress of this decay, and forced to spend days and nights in vaults and charnel houses. Charnel houses, if any of you study Romeo and Juliet, is where dead bodies are laid to rest. So he spends days and nights. He's forced to? Really? My attention was fixed upon every object, the most insupportable delicacy of the human feelings. I saw how the fine form of man was degraded and wasted. I had beheld the corruption of death succeed to take over from the blooming cheek of life. I saw how the worm inherited the wonders of the eye and brain. I paused, examining and analysing the minutiae of causation, as exemplified in the change from life to death and death to life, until, from the midst of this darkness, a sudden light broke in upon me. A light so brilliant and wondrous, yet so simple, that whilst I became dizzy with the immensity of the prospect which it illustrated, I was surprised among so many men of genius who had directed their inquiries towards the same science, that I alone should be reserved to discover so astonishing a secret. A point about the age of enlightenment. Make a note in your margin, the age of enlightenment. The age of enlightenment was a time of science, the age of science, the dawn of reason. Shelley is criticizing this. Romantic writers criticize this. Science gaining godlike power over things. The Romantic writers criticize this. Hold that thought. It'll come in context. Remember, he adds realism. He reminds us this is not a madman's talking. He says this is real. This is verisimilitude. He's adding realism to his story. Remember, I'm not recording the visions of a madman. The sun does not more certainly shine in the heavens than that which I now affirm is true. Some miracle might have produced it, yet at the stages of discovery were distinct and probable. It's not a miracle. It was distinct and probable. There was a kind of an order to the way it happened. After days and nights of incredible labour and fatigue, tiredness, I succeeded in discovering the cause of generation and life. And nay, more, I became myself capable of bestowing anima, life, upon lifeless matter. It's interesting he doesn't think about bringing back Elizabeth or Caroline. He decides to make a new male creature, and he makes it gigantic of stature, different to the rest of us. So he doesn't bring those he loved back to life. He brings dead parts, hideous, sewn together, a perfect being that is so far from perfect. The astonishment which I'd first experienced on this discovery soon gave way to delight and rapture. After so much time being spent in painful labour, interesting that he takes away the need for women to give birth and consistently uses labour, consummation, my toil, labour. He uses it a few times. Look for that. He literally takes away the need for woman in the process of life-making. Womb, not needed. The female, not needed. Sex, which Frankenstein so clearly avoids, is not needed. On the night with Elizabeth, he said, tonight is dreadful, dreadful, Elizabeth. He's just got married, by the way, and they're about to go in and have their wedding night. Tonight will be dreadful, dreadful. But he's fearful of sex, fearful of his own sexuality, fearful of women. So he quite literally removes the need for women. After so much time spent in painful labour, to arrive at once at the summit of my desires was the most gratifying consummation, kind of gathering together of my toils. But this discovery was so great and overwhelming that all the steps by which I had progressively led to it were obliterated, and I beheld only the result. What had been the study and desire of the wisest men since the creation of the world was now within my grasp. And again, Never Let Me Go, for example, cancer is curable. And they talk about that all of these things can be cured: motor neuron disease, cancer. Hubris. The hubris of science. The hubris of humanity. Not like a magic scene, it all opened upon me at once. The information I'd obtained was of a nature rather to direct my endeavours, so shall I soon point them towards the object of my search. And then he says, I'd found a passage to life. I see by your eagerness and hope, and the wonder and hope with which your eyes express, my friend, that you expect to be informed of the secret, with which I'm acquainted. That cannot be. Listen patiently until the end of my story, and you will easily perceive why I am reserved on that subject. I will not lead you on, unguarded and ardent as I was then, to your destruction and infallible misery. He says, if I gave you this, you would fall down the same path as me. No, I'll keep the knowledge for myself. And very similarly to the Miss Emily and Madame in chapter 22, they give them details, but only after they've really driven after them. So on page 258, what was this Morningdale scandal you keep mentioning, Miss Emily? You'll have to tell us because we don't know. Well, I suppose there's no reason you should. It was never such a large matter in the wider world. And then Frankenstein says, learn from me, if not by my precepts, at least by my example, how dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge. He says, you'd be much happier if you didn't seek after knowledge. But later in the novel, he's going to encourage all the mariners that they should carry on to the North Pole so they can seek glory. Hang on a second, weren't you just saying that you shouldn't try and acquire knowledge? And then goes on to try and persuade all the shipmates to acquire knowledge and put themselves in danger, probable death. There's definitely a dichotomy between Frankenstein's teaching and actions. Next paragraph. When I found so astonishing a power placed in my hands, I hesitated for a long time concerning the manner in which I should employ it. I wasn't sure how I should use it. Although I possessed the capacity of bestowing animation, yet to prepare a frame for the reception of it with all its intricacies of fibres, muscles, veins, still remained a work of inconceivable difficulty and labour. I doubted at first whether I should attempt the creation of a being like myself. He doesn't actually think about whether he should do it at all. He thinks about what kind of creature it should be. But my imagination was too much exalted by my first success to permit me to doubt of my ability to give life to an animal as complex and wonderful as man. The materials at present within my command hardly appeared adequate to so arduous an undertaking, but I doubted not that I should ultimately succeed. I prepared myself for a multitude of reverses. My operations might be incessantly baffled, and at last my work might be imperfect. And then he carries on, he's encouraged. He decides to make it of gigantic stature, about 8 feet in height, and proportionally large. After having formed this determination, I've spent some months in successfully collecting and arranging my materials. He talks about them as materials, donation, agitated, materials, body parts. No one can conceive the variety of feelings which bore me onwards like a hurricane in the first enthusiasm of success. Life and death to me to be ideal bounds, which I should break through and pour a torrent of light into our dark world. A new species will bless me as its creator and source. Now, just so you know, if you create life, they don't wake up every day and bless you as their creator and source. I doubt you get up every morning and say to your parents, Mum and Dad, thank you so much for being my creator and source. I'm so glad you made me. Frankenstein's hubris knows no bounds. He thinks this progeny, this child, will adore him, bless him for creating it. He wants its adoration. He doesn't want the responsibility of parenthood. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. He says he assumes they're going to be happy and excellent. Yet, of course, when he creates the creature and brings it to life, he doesn't take responsibility for it. And he says that they are going to owe their being to me. You should be thankful. They should be thankful for what I have done. Very similar to Never Let Me Go. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. Pursuing these reflections, I thought that if I could bestow animation upon lifeless matter, I might in the process of time, although I now found it impossible, renew life where death had apparently devoted the body to corruption. These thoughts supported my spirits while I pursued my undertaking with unremitting ardour. My cheek had grown pale with study. My person had become emaciated with confinement. He locks himself away. He becomes less than human by creating life. This is not a natural process. This is not conception. This is not connection. This is not sex. This is not pregnancy. This is deeply troubling. This is deeply scientific and far removed from the beauty of creation, the balance of humanity. Similarly, clones created in factories and never let me go is a far cry from the beauty and balance of family life. The schools, Hailsham and others, with no parental involvement, and these young people growing up without the psychological input of parents. This is a far cry from natural creation. Sometimes on the very brink of certainty I failed, yet still I clung to the hope the next day or the next hour might realise. One secret which I alone hoped to possess, I hope to which I dedicated myself. The moon gazed in on my midnight labours. The moon is a very important symbol. While with unrelaxed and breathless eagerness I pursued nature to her hiding places. Key quotation. Who shall conceive the horrors of my secret toil as I dabbled amongst the unhallowed damps of the grave, or tortured the living animal, Galvani, to animate lifeless living animal, to bring to life clay, like God, but not dust to dust, from clay to life. This is not paradise lost. This is not Adam being created beautifully from clay. This is a horrific reversioning of the first man, the new Adam. My limbs now tremble and my eyes swim with the remembrance, but then a resistless, almost frantic impulse urged me forward. I seemed to have lost all soul or sensation, but only for this one pursuit. It was indeed a passing trance that made me feel with renewed acuteness. As soon as the unnatural stimulus ceasing to operate, I'd returned to my old habits. I collected bones from charnel houses and disturbed with profane, which means unholy, profane fingers, the tremendous secrets of the human frame, in a solitary chamber, or rather cell, at the top of the house, and separated from all the other apartments by a gallery and a staircase. I kept my workshop a filthy creation. My eyeballs were starting from their sockets. In attending to the details of my employment, the dissecting room and slaughterhouse furnished many of my materials, and often mid my human nature turn with loathing from my occupation. Miss Emily and Madame said they literally hated the clones and looked down on them with revulsion. It says on page 258, they were kept in the shadows. People did their best not to think about you. And again, for example, on page 264, there were times I'd look down at you from my study window and I feel such revulsion. This is creating life, and they're revolted by it in both novels. While still urged on by an eagerness which perpetually increased, I brought my work near to a conclusion. The summer months passed while I was engaged thus, heart and soul in one pursuit. It was a beautiful season. Never did the fields bestow a more plentiful harvest, or the vines yield a more luxuriant vintage, but my eyes were insensible to the charms of nature. It takes them away from nature. In pursuing to be like God, to be this Prometheus, to be this master scientist, he actually becomes less of a human. He doesn't recognize nature. And the same feelings which made me neglect the scenes around me also caused me to forget those friends who were many miles absent, and whom I'd not seen for a long time. I knew my silence disquieted them, and while I remembered the words of my father, I know that while you are pleased with yourself, you will think of us with affection, and we shall hear regularly from you. Of course they don't. You must pardon me, says Alphonse, if I regard any interruption in your correspondence as a proof that your other duties were equally neglected. If you do not write to us, I assume you will be neglecting your other duties. How right he is. I knew well, therefore, what would be my father's feelings, but I could not tear myself away from my employment. Loathsome in itself, but it had taken irresistible hold of my imagination. I wished, as it were, to procrastinate all that related to my feelings of affection until the great object which swallowed up every habit of nature should be completed. I then thought my father would be unjust if he ascribed my neglect to vice or faultiness on my part, but I am now convinced that he was justified in conceiving that I should not be altogether free from blame. A human being in perfection always ought to preserve a calm and peaceful mind, and never to allow passion or transitory desire to disturb his tranquility. I do not think the pursuit of knowledge is an exception to this rule. Now, this is important. He's about to say this, and I'll paraphrase it for you. He's about to say, if you're pursuing something that takes you away from calmness and stops you from mixing with others, then you shouldn't do it. But again, later on, there's this irony that he then goes on to persuade Walton that he should carry on with his pursuit. If the study to which you apply yourself has a tendency to weaken your affections and to destroy your taste for those simple pleasures in which no alloy can possibly mix, then that study is certainly unlawful. That is to say, not befitting the human mind. If this rule was observed, and then he says all these things wouldn't have happened. He then, winter, spring, and summer passed, the last paragraph of the chapter, but I'd not watched the blossom. The leaves withered, and he plainly how well he succeeded. His enthusiasm was checked by anxiety. He feels he's doomed to slavery, to my toil in the mines, unwholesome trade, and he's oppressed by a fever. He shuns his fellow creatures as if I'd been guilty of a crime. He is guilty of a crime. This is illegal activity. Sometimes I grew alarmed at the wreck I perceived I'd become. The energy of my purpose alone sustained me. My labours would soon end, and I believed that exercise and amusement would then drive away the incipient disease. And I promised myself both of these when my creation should be complete. Very important, at the end of this chapter, he's about to create life. He just thinks about creating life and then it being over and him returning to his life as before. He simply doesn't think about the moral implications of creating a child, a being. And this is the point where we as readers are deeply frustrated by Frankenstein and his hubris and his lack of parental responsibility, in the same way are deeply frustrated by the society that allowed the clones to come about. And that they are institutionalized, and he thinks about only creating life with absolutely no thought to the childhood that he's going to give this creature, when he himself said he had this idealized and perfect childhood, and he simply doesn't even consider the way that he might bring up a child or look after a child or the responsibility of parenthood to it. He had such an idealized childhood and he's not willing to give that to another. And again, for example, all the other characters who are outside the clone system, all the humans in Never Let Me Go, don't want to think about what they've created. They aren't willing to not have clones, so they can't have limbs and organs and cures for their diseases. But they won't take responsibility for looking after them or seeing them as human. They're quite happy to do so while they are seen as outside and controlled and other and different and less than human. But of course, the moment they become superior of intellect or they have art, we allow that. But when they become too close to humanity, we are threatened by them. And they're then, of course, sent back to their factories and back to their hideous places where they are kept. Chapter 5. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive movement agitated its limbs. How can I describe my emotions in this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch with whom such infinite pains and care I had endeavoured to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful, beautiful, great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, that these seemed almost the same colour as the dun white sockets in which they were set, and his shrivelled complexion and straight black lips. The different accidents of life. There is no accident here. The different accidents of life are not so changeable as the feelings of human nature. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this I deprived myself of rest and health. I desired with an ardour that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to endure the aspect of the being that I had created, I rushed from the room and continued for a long time traversing my bedchamber, unable to compose my mind to sleep. At length lassitude succeeded to the tumult I had endured, and I threw myself on my bed in my clothes, endeavouring to seek out a few moments of forgetfulness. It was in vain I slept. Indeed, but I was disturbed by the wildest dreams. Dreams, weird, incestuous dreams. I thought of Elizabeth. I thought I saw Elizabeth in the bloom of health walking in the streets of Ingolstadt. Delighted and surprised, I embraced her. But as I imprinted the first kiss On her lips, they became livid with hue, the colour of death. The features appeared to change, and I thought I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. A shroud, a cloth to wrap a dead body. A shroud enveloped her form, and I saw grave worms crawling in the folds of the flannel. I started from my sleep with horror. A cold dew covered my forehead. My teeth chattered, and every limb became convulsed. You notice how the creature convulsed and Frankenstein convulses when by the dim and yellow light of the moon, of course, chapter 4, the yellow moon, nature. Feminine nature looking in on him, the moon looking in and seeing what he is doing, taking over the power of God, life and death. As it forced its way through the window shutters, I beheld the wretch, most miserable monster I had created. He held... Wait a second now, this is the worst thing ever. Hold this thought. He held up the curtain of the bed, and his eyes, if eyes they may be called, were fixed on me. His jaws opened and he muttered some inarticulate sounds. Gaga, gaga. While a grin wrinkled his cheeks. Oh, hang on a sec. This is, how dare. He lifts the curtain, makes noises and smiles. Well, that is terrible, isn't it? He might have spoken, but I did not hear. One hand was stretched out. He reaches out for his creator. One's hand was stretched out, seemingly to detain me, to stop me, but I escaped and rushed downstairs. I took refuge in the courtyard belonging to the house in which I inhabited, where I remained during the rest of the night, walking up and down in the greatest agitation, listening attentively, catching and fearing each sound as if it were to announce the approach of the, hang on a second, demoniacal corpse to which I had so miserably given life. Oh, no mortal could support the horror of that countenance. No one could look at it without hating it. Hello, the clones. A mummy, again endued with animation, could not be so hideous as that wretch. I had gazed on him while unfinished. He was ugly then. Why did you create him if he was so ugly? But then those muscles and joints were rendered capable of motion. It became things such as even Dante, in his Inferno, could have conceived. I passed the night wretchedly. Sometimes my pulse beat quickly, and I hardly felt the palpitation of every artery. At others, I nearly sank on the ground through languor and extreme weakness. Mingled with this horror, I felt the bitterness of disappointment. The dreams that had been my food and rest for a long space of time were now become a hell to me, and the change was so rapid, the overthrow so complete. Morning, dismal and wet, at length dawned, and I discovered my sleepless and aching eyes the church, God, of Ingolstadt, its white steeple and clock which indicated the 6th hour. The porter opened the gates of the court, which had been, at that night, had been my asylum, my safe place, which I issued into the streets, pacing them with quick steps, as if I sought to avoid the wretch whom I feared every turning of the street would present to my view. I did not dare to return to the apartment which I inhabited, but felt impelled to hurry on, although drenched by the rain which poured from black and comfortless sky. This is so important. When you read this chapter, look at chapter 11, which is in the other edition, for example, Volume 2, Chapter 3, because you've got this parallel of Frankenstein narrating the creation of the creature, and you've got the creature experiencing it as a child, his first emotions, his first feelings. We can work out through chapter 11 him coming down through the room, coming down through the apartment, feeling thirst and lonely. He weeps and makes a fire. And it's devastating to compare Frankenstein's narrative of his creating of the creature and his hatred of it and the creature. Of course, the other thing is in chapter 11, the creature notes that a light stole over the heavens. He isn't fearful of the moon. The moon doesn't force its way into his life. He is at one with nature, eating berries. He collects branches. He sinks into a slumber on the ground, and he watches a shepherd. His first acts are kindness. And what is immediately apparent is he's hated. The shepherd, where he goes into the hut to seek shelter, shrieks loudly as if pandemonium had appeared. He remembers the treatment of the night before. He's immediately mistreated again and again and again. Frankenstein creates the creature, walks around the city of Ingolstadt, and very swiftly meets Clerval, who brings him back to life, just as Walton does, restores him, looks after him, and helps him get through his sickness until spring. No one is there for the creature. No one is there for the students in Never Let Me Go. And the bullying in Never Let Me Go, the otherness, the treatment of Tommy, they abuse him, they mistreat him, and the manipulation that goes on at Hailsham is really concerning and dressed up as normal teenage behaviour. The mistreatment of the creature is striking and devastating when we read it. And every time I read it, I feel such pain for the creature, the noble savage, the tabula rasa, with his lack of parental responsibility, the lack of society's responsibility for the other. And the same is true of Never Let Me Go.